Okay, we're going to turn our attention back to the budget battle now. One of the biggest points of contention when it comes to balancing New York's books is whether the so-called Millionaires Tax should be extended beyond its year-end expiration. Advocates argue that this would bring in up to $5 billion that could go to restoring the governor's proposed cuts to services, particularly health care and education. Opponents say that taxes are already too high in New York and that job creators are being driven from the state. My first guests tonight fall on either side of this issue, and they have very strong feelings about it. E.J. McMahon is the director of the Empire Center for New York State Policy. He thinks extending the Millionaires Tax is a crummy idea. And Richard Brodsky supports the extension. He's a former Westchester Assemblyman who ran for Attorney General last year. As of today, he is a senior fellow at NYU's School of Public Service. Gentlemen, let's get ready to rumble. I mean, you know, thanks for your time. Okay. I'd just like to start out, if you wouldn't mind, with a brief statement of your position and why you have it. And EJ, let's start with you because you are here, so let's go ahead and do that.
Well, 3 years ago, the legislature enacted a temporary increase by creating two high tax brackets, which basically amounted to the biggest income tax increase in one fell swoop that New York had done since 1961. It was a 31% increase in income taxes for people making over $500,000 in taxable income, and an 11% increase for people making as little as $200,000 for single taxpayers. That was couched as a 3-year temporary increase to help get us over the large revenue loss during the recession.
Right.
It's scheduled to expire at the end of the year. My belief, and I agree with the governor's position on this, is that it should be allowed to expire, that it's a matter of promoting economic growth in New York and making the state more competitive.
Okay. Richard.
Well, it's an ethical matter. At a time when the suffering across the state is enormously widespread, and I'm not just talking about people who work for the government, but property taxpayers, people who use mass transit, it is unethical to focus the suffering only on some New Yorkers. No tax is a good idea inherently, but at a time when we must share the pain, share the sacrifice, to ask New Yorkers who are paying a certain amount of tax to continue that tax so we can get through this crisis is, I think, a moral imperative. We're not talking about a tax increase here. We're talking about continuing a tax rate that's already in place.
Okay. EJ, is it fair to couch this in ethical terms? Because I think that that's what's happening here. The former Assemblyman is saying that we have a responsibility to provide, as a government, as a state, for the people who have the least among us.
Well, that depends on whether you think that the budget, as Governor Cuomo proposes it, will actually hurt people and will create some sort of unethical reduction in government services to the poor. I don't think so. I think the governor has proposed a plan that will create an adjustment in our spending that's long overdue after several years of failing to adjust spending to new economic reality, and that it will actually strengthen the private sector economy, and that in an ethical sense, the best thing for all New Yorkers is an economy that's strong and growing and helps provide people with the opportunities they need to get ahead.
Richard,
that's a very hard position to sustain when you look at, let's say, school aid. The governor is proposing massive reductions in school aid to local school districts. They can either fire people to make that up, or they can raise local property taxes paid not just by the poor, but by the middle class. The notion that the governor's budget can be accomplished without causing real pain, I don't think that's sustainable on any level. And if I'm right that there's going to be real pain, the ethical question here is, should that pain be shared? Should the sacrifice be shared? To have a tax cut for the wealthiest 1 or 2% of New Yorkers, at the same time that school teachers are being laid off and police and firemen are being laid off, makes no sense on an ethical basis, and it doesn't make any sense on an economic basis either.
Well, in terms of the impact on schools in particular and on public employees, and in terms of that phrase, share the sacrifice, what hasn't happened yet has been a great deal of sacrifice from the side of public employees. And one of the alternatives to simply taking a cut in aid and leaving it on the current base is to have mandate relief of the sort that, by the way, a broad cross-section of mayors in both parties are seeking and the school boards are seeking.
Yeah, but we're not seeing it yet. We haven't seen it.
But that's but if you're talking about how to ameliorate the impact of cuts and to minimize the number of layoffs that might be necessary in school districts that, in a lot of cases, frankly, I think the numbers would show, went out on a hiring binge during a period when their aid and their tax revenue was growing quickly. The way to minimize the layoffs is to begin seeking some sacrifices on the other side of the ledger. They've got rising pension costs and benefit costs.
No one
Go
has
ahead,
seriously suggested that you can mandate your relief out of a $9 billion budget gap. Mandate relief is a good thing, and we should try to do it. But in the end, the facts are that the consequences of this budget, if you use public libraries, if you use mass transit, if you pay property taxes, is going to be, you're going to be hurting.
Okay,
That's the consequence of a national recession, and to let a few New Yorkers escape that pain is just not the right thing to do.
But Richard, let me ask you this then. There were many budgets that you approved, that you and your fellow legislators approved, and they were fairly, they had cut education. There was a large education aid cut the last time around, if I'm not mistaken. But at the same time, though, there has not been major concessions from the unions, from the state workers' unions, for years, really. So why not say, okay, everyone has to give, but not the unions, that you have to tax the rich, but not the unions?
I didn't say that, and I'm only responsible for my positions, and I don't.
Okay.
The fact of the matter is that the question of concessions or adjustments, pension adjustments, salary adjustments, all on the table, and there's going to be real change in that area. There already has been, but the question before the House tonight isn't whether we should focus on the unions or we should focus on mandate relief, but whether or not a tax cut for 1 to 1.5% of New Yorkers is the thing to do at a time when the suffering for everyone else on any level is real. They're closing 100 senior centers in New York City because of the state budget cuts. That's real change, real suffering for people. Yeah. Okay, we have to adjust. I get that there are going to be spending cuts. I haven't said we shouldn't have them. What I have said is that at the time when you're doing that, you got to be fair. Look, I don't care if it's Sesame Street or if it's A Wonderful Life or any of the things that make America a community. We share the good times. We share the bad times.
Okay.
The richest New Yorkers off is just not the right thing.
Here's the other side of that, okay? Aside from this temporary tax increase, which is now being conveniently called a tax cut, when it's due to sunset, which is the biggest single income tax increase New York has done on a permanent or temporary basis in now 50 years. Okay, there were permanent tax increases and temporary tax increases that will extend beyond this. Last year, 2 years ago, as part of the budget 2 years ago that included this temporary tax hike, the state enacted a permanent $400 million increase on high-income taxpayers by removing what was left of their itemized deductions. They can't take any itemized deductions for anything except charitable deductions. Then last year, a quarter of an additional 25% of the charitable deductions that the super rich can take, people with over $10 million in income, that was suspended for 2 years. So we'll discourage them from making charitable. Secondly, wait a minute.
I admire anybody who in a public debate about a serious issue like this will stand up for the rights of the people making over $10 million.
Yeah, because the people.
It's a courageous position.
Because here's why it raised 80
for the people of the state.
Because you're talking about philanthropy there, and you're actually creating a disincentive for philanthropy. And when it comes to helping millionaires, the legislature, which Mr. Brodsky was part of, in the midst of doing these other tax increases, and in the midst of temporarily, in effect, borrowing on an interest-free basis $2 billion. Separately from taxpayers by suspending tax credits they had earned for making investments in New York over the next 3 years, preserved one and only one big, giant tax shelter. And that tax shelter was an enormous tax credit for people who produce motion pictures in New York, a favored industry. Do you know that in the middle of all this, they expanded that by $2 billion? We're going to spend $470 million this year subsidizing commercials and TV shows.
Bring in business
All
in
industries bring in business to New York. Okay. You're talking about favoring one industry.
This is getting better and better. PJ is coming out for the people who make over $10 million a year and attacking a tax cut. Look, there's plenty of blame to go around.
That's the kind of tax cut they like.
Lots of things were not done well. And we're in a situation today, a real situation. And there's blood on I don't want to be too dramatic. There will be suffering.
Well, how about, speaking of ethics, how come your former colleagues in the Assembly aren't undoing a $500 million a year tax cuts for people who invest in movies?
Okay, hold on. Okay. Let me ask a strategy question before we get to the tax cuts for movies and we get too far down into this whole situation, because it could go very far spiraling down. Richard, let me ask it of you first, okay? The Assembly Speaker said on one day that he didn't think it was actually feasible to get the millionaires tax done because he didn't think that the Senate would go for it, and he didn't think that the governor would go for it, and so he didn't think it was possible even. Then, almost the next day, he said, but I'm going to put it in my budget, in the Assembly's budget. Why is that politically wise?
Well, there's no better negotiator in the free world than Shelley Silver. And I think in terms of getting a partner, the Republicans in the Senate, be they from Nassau and Suffolk County or from Rochester, Syracuse, get a guy like Joe Roback. He needs to be able to protect the schools. And since upstate schools do very well in the state aid formula, if there isn't enough money to provide state aid, he's going to face angry property taxpayers because their property taxes are going up. So I think there's going to be, once the choices are really stark and before everybody, the choices are going to be between middle-class taxpayers who pay property taxes and EJ's friends who make over $10 million.
Well, here we go again.
So
with the ad hominem stuff. Come
strategically-
on. Just a minute. There's a basic economic fact we're talking about here, and that has to do with whether you hurt the state's economy or not by driving out capital. That's the whole basis of this. This isn't about helping any particular individual. And the argument is, are you knowingly trading a degree of private sector economic growth? You're knowingly doing it in order to preserve spending on the public sector. Let's face it, that's what we're really talking about.
That's a very reasonable argument to make. And we ought to look at it. And it ought to be examined. EJ's many things. He's not crazy.
Well, thank you very much.
That's as good as you're going to get tonight.
I greatly appreciate
it. The fact of the matter is that we should look at that. But we should look at it in the context of everybody else is on the chopping block. And we're in, if you will, a crisis. And in a crisis, you do things you wouldn't normally do. We're talking about a tax cut for people who are making hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of $1,000s a year at a time when you're going to be raising property taxes for the middle class because we can't afford the STAR program.
Okay, hold on. Before you go there, you got one last word to make.
The part about the cut in school aid and your remark that you can't mandate your relief to close a $9 billion budget gap. Here's the point. Is there a big cut in school aid in the budget? Yes. How do school districts cope with that? That's the question that mandate relief answers. What he's leaving out is he's talking about what the result of a big school aid cut is if you leave everything else the same. The same including teachers who've been averaging 5% pay increases a year for the last 3 years through the worst recession since 1981. I mean, those are the types of things that have to change. And there's portraying this as a stark difference between keeping taxes high and eviscerating and making devastating cuts in the budget without changing the rules of the road.
Don't put words in my mouth. I didn't say that. They're going to be spending cuts. And they've got to be adjustments in the relationship public sector unions and employees have with their employer. I said all that stuff. What I am saying is to create a favored class, a group of several 100,000 New Yorkers who not only don't suffer but benefit from this process. That's unethical.
But they've already favored class. You've already increased taxes on these people by billions of dollars a year, which includes a lot of.
That depends on where you start, EJ. When I took over in the Assembly, when the Democrats took over from the Republicans, the marginal tax rate in the state under Republicans was 17.5%.
Okay.
It's down to about 6.7.
Is the tax?
Now it's up a little bit from that. No tax increase is inherently good. I'll give you that. But sometimes you need to preserve the fabric of society.
The income tax now that the state collects is a larger share of the budget, it's a larger share of personal income, and it's a larger share of expenditures than it was in 1977 before the tax cuts started. The tax cuts were initiated and carried out mainly under 2 Democratic governors, with the Assembly fully voting for all of them. The current design of the current income tax
I voted for them. Difference between you and me, EJ, is I've actually cut taxes.
Okay.
And I think it's a good idea. But now, in a crisis where human beings are at stake and the fabric of our social structure is at stake, you don't cut taxes further for the wealthiest New Yorkers.
Okay. I think that we know exactly where both of you stand. I don't think you're ever going to agree. But in the meantime, I also think that people pretty much understand the difference between the starkness of this, on both sides of this argument. And unfortunately, we are out of time, because really, I would love to just let this thing roll for the rest of the show. Unfortunately, I have other things I have to get through. I do want to thank you, though. Okay. Richard Brodsky, it's great to see you, and also EJ McMahon.
Nice to be here, and thank you to EJ.
Thanks so much, you guys.